All right. Hi, Samila. Thanks so much for participating in our second Just Research Q&A. This conversation is going to focus on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and that's housing. But first, I want to provide some framing for our conversation. It's not a secret. There is a housing affordability crisis in Connecticut. In dollars and cents today, the median rent in Connecticut is $1,374, and the median home value in Connecticut is $323,700. Meanwhile, the median income in Connecticut is $90,213 pre-taxes. When we break down income by race, we know that Connecticut's white residents earn an average of $98,855 per year. Black residents earn $59,728, and Latina residents earn $56,787 on average per year. And again, this is pre-taxes. In terms of bricks and mortar, and this is a little reductive, the lack of housing development creates limited housing overall, and this drives up demand, ratcheting up the costs on the existing stock available. In fact, Connecticut had the fourth highest increase on the housing price index from 2022 to 2023 at 9.9%. This not only makes relative housing affordability a challenge, it makes deeply affordable housing scarce. And this is one of the reasons Connecticut is considered a high cost of living state. Too many Connecticut residents are struggling to afford the basic needs of housing, to say nothing of food, clothing, and childcare. And so we're seeing a rise in evictions, foreclosures, and homelessness. This is the story across Connecticut. Our report that Connecticut Voices for Children released today speaks to these issues. And I want to bring our report author, Samila Adelaide. Samila, in 5 sentences or less, what is our latest housing report all about?
Thank you, Emily. The report delves into the impact of zoning and land use restrictions on Connecticut's families and children, examining their connection to housing affordability challenges. Emphasizing the racialized impact of this nexus, we explore the relationship between zoning restrictions and housing affordability issues. Building on previous reports that touched on land use and zoning reforms, this report takes a deeper dive, expanding beyond renters to include homeowners. It not only considers the risks posed to families and children, but also provides policy recommendations to promote housing stability.
Thanks so much for that, Samila. You know, at the heart of Connecticut's affordable housing crisis is the history of how income and wealth was and is accumulated in the United States and in our state. And it's worth unpacking this history just a little. You know, we tend to think of the North and Connecticut as being distant from slavery and its legacy, but Connecticut was actually the last New England state to abolish slavery and at points had the largest population of enslaved people in New England. And this is important to understand because enslaved people would have been counted towards a person's wealth as part of their personal estate. The highest concentration of enslaved people were in Fairfield County, which, as many of us know, now contains some of the wealthiest towns and most expensive properties in both Connecticut and the US. Connecticut's residential segregation can be dated back to the 1920s with the Zoning Enabling Act, which was passed by the 1923 Connecticut General Assembly. And zoning regulations over the years have been built off of historically segregative and racially discriminating policies and practices that effectively control where Black and Brown people can live. In the 1930s, redlining largely prevented the creation of Black intergenerational wealth because it prevented people of color, and especially Black people, from home ownership. Even when Black residents were able to afford a home in green coded neighborhoods, property deeds across Connecticut restricted the purchase of certain homes to white people only. And while this practice is illegal and unenforceable now, at the time, this made it impossible for people of color, specifically Black, Latina, Asian, and Native people, as well as Jewish people, to move into white suburban neighborhoods. We can also look at blockbusting, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, and single family zoning, which still exists today, as well as the historical disinvestment in urban centers and communities as other examples of discrimination that perpetuate segregation. Our state's income and wealth divides, which are perpetuated by our broken tax code, criminal legal system, and exploitative job market that forces people to work multiple jobs to make ends meet, prevent housing affordability and home ownership. Thus, the cycle, a vicious one, continues. So, Mila, what's the impact of our state's restrictive land use and zoning laws to building affordable housing in Connecticut today?
Great question, Emily. First, we have the problem of slow housing development. Connecticut just isn't building housing like we used to. The aging housing stock, which can lead to higher rates of demolitions at best and unhealthy and unsafe housing conditions at worst, as well as a notable decline in housing permits issued post-Great Recession, has contributed to slower housing production growth in the state. While there was a slight increase in permits issued in 2022, the cumulative impact of years of insufficient building has left Connecticut lagging in housing unit production. This disparity is evident when comparing the percentage of housing units that were built between 1990 and 2022, where Connecticut falls short of the national average at 20.2% compared to the housing unit production across the US during this time period, which comprised 37.8% of the total housing stock. The state also recorded the lowest growth in housing units in the Northeast from 2012 to 2022, indicating a restrained housing supply. Restrictive zoning and land use policies contribute to decreased housing density and act as barriers to affordable housing development. By discouraging construction of multifamily housing, these policies limit the number of developed housing units, leading to a shortage and driving housing prices upward. The resultant high cost of housing relative to income is evident in our report, showcasing how home ownership and rental affordability in Connecticut lag behind the national average.
Thanks so much for that, Samila. I got to see Matthew Desmond a while back. He wrote a book called Poverty by America that a lot of people are talking about right now. I've read it. It's very good. I highly recommend it. I may be a little biased though, because if you know our work at Connecticut Voices for Children, several chapters will sound familiar to you. Anyway, I was thinking of him as you were talking because he said something that I had read but forgotten, and I think it's worth elevating in this Q&A, which is that Democrats, in theory, are more likely to support land use and zoning reforms that would desegregate towns. But that's, again, in theory. In practice, however, Democrats are no more likely to support desegregation laws than a Republican homeowner. In fact, a Republican renter is more likely to support land use and zoning reforms than a Democrat homeowner. He went on to say that maybe the country's not so divided after all, which I think was meant to be a joke, but also a real observation about class and wealth divides, which often fall upon racial lines. Now, we're a nonpartisan organization, but I mentioned this as a tee up to my next two questions, Samila, which are about the impact of Connecticut's restrictive land use and zoning laws on renters and homeowners. So first, what's the impact on renters here?
So for renters, this scarcity of affordable rental housing poses a significant challenge. While many households secure stable rental accommodations, renters face several factors beyond their control that put them at a higher risk of housing loss or instability than homeowners. These factors encompass insecurity of tenure resulting from property owners' refusal to renew leases, termination of month-to-month leases, insufficient property maintenance of aging housing units, or shifts in property ownership. Renters make up roughly 34% of households in Connecticut, with a larger representation of families of color and lower income households among this demographic. Limited housing options often results in residents living in unhealthy and unsafe conditions, and high rents often lead to missed payments and a heightened risk of eviction. The shortage of alternative housing options compounds the issue as high costs persist due to the housing shortage. Our updated data highlights the more significant challenge of rent affordability in municipalities that have constructed relatively fewer housing units since 1990. We have demonstrated how the shortage disproportionately affects Black and Latino households, as well as households with children. Among tenant households, 26.2% of Black households and 20.9% of Latino households have faced rent payment challenges, significantly surpassing the 8.5% of white renter households. Additionally, 20.7% of renter households with children were behind on rent payments. So, with so many unable to keep up with rent payments, the risk of evictions is higher.
Thank you for that, Samila. What about homeowners now? How are they impacted by Connecticut's restrictive land use and zoning laws?
Yes, great question. Connecticut homeowners are not immune from the affordable housing crisis. In fact, the housing shortage poses a dual challenge. It impedes initial home ownership opportunities and exacerbates the risk of losing homes. This has profound racial implications, as Black and Latina households are less likely to own homes compared to their white counterparts. This disparity is rooted in historical factors, as you mentioned, Emily, and in Connecticut, it also translates into a higher likelihood of home loss due to housing-related costs. Despite home ownership representing a pathway to housing stability, the hurdles for becoming homeowners are intensified during housing affordability challenges, leading to an increased risk of losing their homes. Black and Latina households across the state have lower home ownership rates. While 51.1% of Latina households in the US own their homes, only 41.8% in Connecticut are homeowners. Although homeowners typically enjoy more stability than renters and have access to a number of support programs like loan modification, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority loan programs, and emergency mortgage assistance during financial hardship, there are many gaps in the support. Unpaid sewer fees, property taxes, or mortgage payments can lead to foreclosure, forcing numerous households out of their homes. For many low and middle income households that own homes, their primary investment lies here, making home loss a significant financial setback. Mortgage foreclosure, the most common form of foreclosure, involves lenders seeking to enforce the mortgage associated with a defaulted loan within the state, while potentially resulting in the forced sale of the property or transfer to the lender. These situations highlight the risks faced by households with lower or medium incomes, particularly during economic downturns where what might seem like a permanent home can be lost. Our analysis reveals that Black and Latina homeowners report falling behind on mortgage payments. While 5.5% of Connecticut homeowners have missed mortgage payments, the percentage for Black and Latina households are notably higher within the state at 15.9% and 8.1%, respectively. These figures also demonstrate that Black and Latino homeowners in Connecticut fare worse than their counterparts nationally. As a result, Connecticut foreclosures are on the rise, despite a decline in foreclosure rates spurred by proactive government initiatives during the pandemic.
Thank you, Samila. So it sounds like restrictive land use and zoning laws impact both renters and homeowners negatively. How does all of this keep households displaced, if at all?
Great question. We have discussed how restrictive zoning and land use regulations make suitable housing less affordable and increase foreclosures and evictions. Foreclosures and evictions elevate the risk of experiencing homelessness. Housing unaffordability emerges as a significant societal predictor of elevated homelessness rates. For those already grappling with homelessness, foreclosures and evictions intensify the competition for available housing units. In regions where housing is prohibitively expensive, individuals experiencing homelessness face greater challenges in securing stable housing. Unfortunately, following a period of decline, homelessness is resurging in Connecticut with an increasing number of people recorded as homeless, spending more prolonged periods without stable housing.
So it's clear that housing is a hot topic and, there's wide agreement on the problems. Where there's less agreement is how we solve for the various crises residents in our state are experiencing. What are the key recommendations to address housing affordability that are proposed in our report, Smila?
So we recommended several policies, some of which we proposed in previous reports and some new ones. We divided them into three buckets. The first bucket includes recommendations for the removal of barriers to adequate housing supply to support growing workforce needs. Here we propose that policymakers could introduce policies to encourage denser housing development in towns and neighborhoods and encourage diverse housing development. These policy recommendations include requiring that towns promote affordable housing development, requiring analysis of housing development moratoria and downzoning, incentivizing housing development near transit stations, expanding public housing authorities' jurisdiction, and reviewing and potentially rezoning industrial and commercial areas. We also call for policymakers to update the building code and requirements to allow for an increased number of housing units. Here we present a few changes that could be made to encourage multifamily housing development. These ideas include legalizing more multifamily buildings with a single staircase, removing restrictions on new housing units within existing buildings, and extending the residential building code to residential buildings with up to 4 housing units. The second bucket includes recommendations to reform procedures to facilitate housing affordability, ensure housing safety, and advance housing justice. Here we propose that policymakers could reform and streamline the housing approval process to make them more efficient. This includes expanding criteria for zoning variances and allowing applications for reduced parking minimums. We also propose that policymakers streamline procedures to ensure access to healthy and safe housing. This includes mandating the disclosure of the natural owners of rental properties and implementing landlord licensing programs, increasing fines for landlords who violate the housing code and are prosecuted criminally, establishing special penalties for landlords who exhibit a consistent pattern of neglect, and we also recommend funding local health departments to conduct housing code inspections. Additionally, policymakers should introduce and expand measures to prevent excessive rent increases and curb practices that promote housing loss. Policymakers have the opportunity to bolster rent protections by requiring the creation of fair rent commissions and imposing caps on excessive rent increases. Additionally, the legislature can restrict punitive foreclosures targeting homeowners who fall behind on property tax payments or other non-mortgage fees. The third bucket includes policy recommendations to invest in mitigating housing displacement and promoting housing stability. Here we recommend that policymakers expand protection for tenants in eviction cases. Here we call for policymakers to extend identity sealing of eviction records and enhance enforcement, and also to expand good cause eviction protections. We also make recommendations to expand income and income equivalent support for low and middle income families. Here we propose policies aimed at providing assistance in the form of property tax credit and free legal support for those facing eviction. Finally, we make recommendations to improve the effectiveness of the homelessness response system. Here we propose that the state allocate additional annual funds to support the operational cost of the homelessness response system. We also recommend that the state provide annual investment in supportive housing.
Thank you for that, Samila. It sounds like there's a lot of new recommendations mixed with some of our recommendations from past reports. And so it really creates a comprehensive set of recommendations for folks to think about. We're coming to the last question here. Why should Connecticut residents and lawmakers care about land use and zoning reforms?
Thank you. Land use and zoning reform are at the heart of Connecticut's affordable housing crisis, and what's more, the restrictive nature of these laws contributes to racial inequities in terms of wealth and economic mobility, adversely affecting low and middle income families and jeopardizing their housing stability. There are other policies that impact Connecticut residents' ability to stretch their income. However, a root cause for the housing scarcity that's driving up demand, and as a result, housing costs are our restrictive land use and zoning laws. Because of this, homelessness and other forms of housing displacement are rising. We all want to live and build a vibrant economy. Affordable housing is critical to this vision, but it requires land use and zoning reforms now. While these reforms permit more affordable housing options in every town across Connecticut, residents need urgent support to ensure housing security. So this report, as well as our last two housing reports, provide good policy recommendations that provide the immediate, middle, and long-term actions needed.
Thank you, Samila. I think it was a perfect way to end our Q&A. Appreciate you so much for joining me in this conversation and for your good work on this report. If you're tuning into our Just Research Q&A, we're grateful for you too. Connecticut Voices for Children is a research and advocacy organization. At Voices, we believe that every funding and every policy decision should lead us to the future we want, which is a fair and just society where all Connecticut children reach their full potential. Our issue areas center research-backed policies that eradicate poverty and advance family economic security. If this better world sounds good to you, we invite you to join the movement by signing up for our email list or making a donation. Links to do both can be found on our website at ctvoices.org.